o'clock. But let's talk NBA Finals, talk NBA champion Boston Celtics, and let's talk about how dominant this team was. So here are a couple of the nuggets about this team, stats, statistical achievements of this Boston Celtics team this season. The Celtics outscored teams in the regular season by over 11 points per game, the fifth largest margin ever. Their 8.1 differential in the playoffs also was one of the best ever. Basically, Boston outscored its opponents by a total of 1,083 points. That's the fourth highest raw point differential in NBA history, one spot behind the Durant era Warriors, which were the best. If you look at the regular season and the playoffs combined, their record was the 11th best winning percentage of all NBA championship teams. They became the third team in the 21st century and the ninth team since the modern playoff format in 1983 to lose 3 games or fewer en route to a title. And if you go look, they finished with the most efficient offense in NBA history, which actually improved throughout the season. We were talking about this actually during the season when the scoring actually declined in the NBA, their scoring actually got better when the rest of the league on average declined. They made the second most 3-pointers in NBA history at a 38.8% clip. They finished with the second best defense this season, and had multiple guys on the all defensive team just on both ends of the floor. I mean, and in the regular season and in the postseason, they were as good as advertised. That's put in perspective, Patrick. Obviously, you watch more NBA than I do, but I mean that was the case early on in the season. I believe they were the favorite going into the season and dominated the regular season. Favorites going into the playoffs, dominated the playoffs. I guess it was a little boring considering it wasn't a lot of drama because they just did exactly what everybody thought they would do.
Yeah, I mean, and that was the deal is, I think the adding of Porzingis, everybody going, it is going to be really good. And when he was healthy, it was. There was just a piece it made a really good team, a really, really, really good team. To add in the 7-footer, the guy who's able to play at a high level, hit threes, do all these things. And because they were good enough without him, they could continue to win even when he has his injury problems, because he's going to have those. They were still able to win. And, you were able to switch off. You have 2 guys that can kind of take over the lead, and Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. So there wasn't a wear out period of time where you see with a lot of guys where, we like Tyrese Haliburton, perfect example of a guy who can have great stretches in the season, but for 82 games and in the playoffs, it's just hard for one guy to carry the team. They have 2 guys in Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, and either one of them will pick up the slack if the other one goes down. You add in a Jrue Holiday, who was just such a key piece for this team. They added Derek White last season in a trade that was a trade that, honestly, when they traded for Derek White, that was at a point where they didn't know if they were basically middling of, they were a 7th or 8th, seed in the Eastern Conference at that point when they traded for Derek White. And they weren't sure if, so the Spurs made the trade thinking maybe this will be a good pick. We trade him there, and then they bomb out the back end of the season. It did not happen. They end up playing much better, go on to play much better, and he's been a huge piece of what they've done. Al Horford fit in well enough, fit into his role as well. Just everything they were able to put together there, it came out, and you saw it, perform for, other than they would have brief lapses, that team would be able to perform. Yeah. And Joe Mazzulla is going to start entering into weird conversations. And I think Joe Mazzulla is now in early Eric Spoelstra category of, is it the team or is it the coach?
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. I got you.
And so, because I mean, it took Eric Spoelstra a long time to get any respect. Mm-hmm. And with Mazzulla, he's not going to get an ounce of respect, because you look at this roster and go, yeah, but tons of coaches could have won with this team. So he's not going to get necessarily respect for winning this title. So I put him in that category of like, man, I know it sucks, but that's what happens when you walk into a great team. Most young coaches don't walk into a ready, set, let's go situation and just we're sprinting day one. You don't walk into that. But you have to give some credit. This team could have fallen apart at plenty of times and not stayed on track. So you have to give him some credit, but how much of that we don't know. How much is this? It's a similar situation as well. People are going to give a lot of credit to Brad Stevens.
Yeah, no, you're right. I love that comparison. You're right. That narrative is so similar, and it's like Spoelstra has to lose all of his stars, all those superstars, to finally get credit. Like, no, Spoelstra's a hell of a coach. It's like, so we had to lose all the superstars for people to appreciate how good of a coach he is.
So that's one of the things coming out of this is, okay, is Mazzulla actually, because another thing I suppose not necessarily the best interview, at least early now.
Yeah.
That you see his interviews and you're like, oh, I don't like this guy. He just doesn't seem like he's a bright guy. But everyone who talks about him glowingly.
Yeah.
So that's just an interesting piece of it. Of the one piece that you would probably think was the weakest, which was the head coach. We don't know. It's just an unknown factor right now. It's an unknown quantity that maybe he is a great head coach, and we're just not giving him enough credit. Or maybe it was the same.
But you got to give, if Brad Stevens would do it, if you trust him in terms of how he built the roster, you want to give him credit for that, then he's going to choose a coach, a damn good coach. Like the whole Pat Riley thing. It's like, it's Pat Riley. You thought he just chose some jabroni to be in charge? He's a smart guy, one of the smartest basketball guys around. So, I think his acumen will be reflected in his hire, even if they're not a proven commodity. But that's a great comparison. You're right. There's no doubt of it. I remember that narrative about Spoelstra too. I remember it whenever it was. Nah, he's just a placeholder.
I mean, it took really until taking Jimmy Butler to the finals, and then everybody went, okay, fine. You took like your fifth team to the finals. You took another group.
Yeah, you're right. But only with one superstar, really, though. You have to do it. If he did it with the big three again, like he did the Heatles, nobody wanted to give him props for that in his role in their success. But no, that's a great point. I agree with you on that. And I would jump to the other side of this because, yes, clearly the Celtics were a dominant team. I mean, they said the favorites going into the season, going into the playoffs, dominate the regular season, dominate the playoffs. But I also think it can be true, and I think two things can be true at the same time, that they did have an easier path than some other championship teams recently in the last 25, 30 years, just because of how injury riddled the Eastern Conference was. And, we all saw it. I believe the stat is that the Celtics opponents missed a whopping 37 player games due to injury in the first two rounds of the playoffs.
Yeah.
So it was just, and by the way, the Celtics could have beat all these teams. There's no question.
Yeah.
But maybe some wear and tear, maybe wearing them down a little bit, maybe testing them a little bit, exposing some weaknesses that other teams, that's how the playoffs work. Like you get kind of exposed, level by level, round by round, you get worn out round by round. That didn't really happen to them because their opposing teams, they were dealing with a ton of injuries. And by the way, this has kind of been a trend in the NBA lately. And Patrick and I have talked about it, but and you'll look at this postseason. I believe if you look at player participation charts and you look at NBA stars who have made an all-star team or an all-NBA team, this year they 11 different players in the postseason, based on that standard, that criteria, missed a total of 47 games in the postseason, based on that metric. And that's a lot of games for star players to miss.
Yeah.
The Celtics did have Kristaps Porzingis who was out, but as Patrick mentioned, I mean, you were just adding him to an already loaded squad. So they actually had the depth to be able to, withstand those types of injuries. Most teams do not. And I will say that the Mavs were relatively healthy too. The Mavs, and that's, a lot of this kind of boils down to that battle of attrition. They were relatively healthy too. And those were the teams, really, your final four teams were kind of your healthiest teams.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because, you looked at, we know they weren't playing him, but Giannis being out, Giannis was one of those guys you thought could be a threat because he's just, whenever you play against one of the best players in the league and one of the most dominant players in the league, he's out of the playoffs, so you don't see that Giannis-Dame matchup. You don't ever get to that one. You don't, Donovan Mitchell is out for their series. He gets knocked out. Jimmy Butler gets knocked out in their series. Tyrese Halliburton gets knocked out in their series. All best players on their teams get knocked out. And then you can add into that Luka fouling out in the one game that was close in this
I didn't
entire
even think
series.
about that.
You add in they foul out Luka, so you don't even get that. The one part of the one game in this series that would have been really entertaining to watch, Luka fouls out in. And again, it's not the refs, or again, it's not Celtics doing this. Oh, I mean, it was kind of. They attacked at him because they were trying to do the right thing. But you miss that as a fan. So as a fan, I think you would sit there and go, this team was never challenged. They were dominant and never challenged. And they're both true. So that's not their fault that they weren't challenged.
I agree.
So you can't put it on them, but it is one of those things of, as I've talked about before, asterisk championships are stupid. Everyone could put one on there, but go ahead and put one on this one too, because there's been one on every single title. So it'll just be one of those debates and one of those things that people will say against it, and I get why, because Boston fans are obnoxious. So I get completely why. Like, I basically had to turn the game off before the end because the writing was on the wall, and you're just like, I don't like watching these people celebrate. Just awful people, at least in the setting of this place. So I don't want to watch them celebrate anymore.
And they've won enough. Like, they're awful, and they've won a lot.
Yeah,
like,
this is their
18th
title.
18th.
Keep winning.
What are y'all celebrating for? Like, it's not even like special. It is special, but you're winning one like every 10 to 12, 20 years.
Yeah, and
come on.
No, and that was apparently I've heard from Mavs fans, they're going like, man, these Celtics fans are going into like Mavs forums and talking trash, and you're like, dude, you won 4-1. Just celebrate the win.
Yeah, you were basically unopposed. Like, you were good.
Yeah, it was.
Like, it was one game that was close.
Yes.
The whole damn series.
So it was. So you watch it, but I mean, as far as the team, it's one of those things. I think because they're a Boston team and because Boston's been so good, that they get a little bit more flack about it because they're not that charismatic in any direction. They're kind of a bland team. Like, Jason Tatum is a very bland guy. His post-game interviews are very bland. Jaylen Brown is a dog on the court, but again, his post-game and praise are not that. There's nothing, there's not really, they don't really have a funny guy on the team. They don't really have an outspoken. They don't really have any of that. They're just kind of a bland team, but they're really, really good at basketball. So you should like them more, except for the fact that I think they get overpowered by the city of Boston, and that wears off on them. So they get a little bit more hate.